it's doing that.
True.
Yeah.
Hi everyone. My name's Alison Vivian. I'm from Jumbunna, one of the researchers there, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming along today. I don't know whether the right expression is that I've drunk the Kool-Aid, because the Kool-Aid didn't work out terribly well for the people who drank it. But being
The wrong Kool-Aid.
the wrong Kool-Aid. But I'm definitely an Indigenous nation building convert. Think that it has the potential to impact in many areas of research, and but much more importantly, has the potential to impact on the well-being of, I think, all Australians, but in particular Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. I'd like, on that note, to acknowledge that wherever we meet in Australia, we meet on Indigenous country, regardless of whether there are buildings or developments or other kinds of infrastructures. I want to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation who have responsibility for this country, and to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here, and also acknowledge the challenges in a particularly hostile environment of exercising sovereign rights to self-determination. We thought we'd start off today by just having you guys introduce yourselves and explain the work that you're doing, because we thought we didn't kind of do this, as you can see, as like a big fancy research forum. We didn't even give you any lunch, where we said come along and hear these guys, because as I said, we really have drunk the Kool-Aid. We really do think that this work, particularly the 30 years work that Steve and Miriam have been involved in the United States, has something to say in Australia. And so what we're hoping for is a conversation here about how this work might impact on your own work. So we thought we'll ask you to introduce yourselves, talk about the kind of work and your own interests. Then these guys are just going to give a very short presentation, each kind of 10 or 15 minutes, about different aspects of the work, and then let's have a conversation afterwards about how we ultimately, we're from UTS, how we might ultimately work together. So thanks again for coming.
So how long are you looking for each person to tell about what they're up to? Are you looking for 5 minutes, 3 minutes?
Oh, let's see how it goes. Yes.
My name is Ros Sortel. I actually don't know my mob, but I've been very lucky to be taken under the wing of the community on the Gold Coast, the Igbo language group up there, called the Merry Peoples. And I'm lucky enough to be with them, and the aunties and uncles there have pushed me over the last couple of years to do a bit more, so I have decided to do my Masters of Research at the moment, and I am looking to find out why our older urban community members are not going online or taking up the opportunities in the libraries to the free access and the training that's there, which is what government's basically saying is the only reason why we're not becoming about learning those skills. But there's obviously a reason other than that, because there's a lot in our community that is still not going online, even though government's forcing them by making all the services only available that way.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm just first year, so I've only just started, but I am thoroughly enjoying it, and meeting some people that I've held in high esteem. Been lucky enough to do that in the last couple of months, because I'm actually from the Gold Coast, as I said, but I'm down here for this year.
Great.
And because I only actually applied to do it with Jumbunna. I learned of your research when I was doing my undergrad, and I just wanted to be part of that.
Well, that's great.
So that's me.
Great. Thank you so much.
My name's Matt Walsh. I'm an Anawan man, so up in the hills, halfway between West Sydney and Brisbane. I have always into nation building, I guess, is number one, I worked at UTS, and to hear Alison speak of nation building, she really is a convert. And like for me, it was number one. What I found interesting was that it just seemed like common sense, because it's what mob had been doing for a long time, using any tool that was available to survive or to flourish or to express their sovereignty. So when I came to UTS, I worked in the employment area here for a long time, and I feel like that we use concepts of nation building to actually progress that as well. The idea of growing our cohorts here to be able to express who we are within the framework that is the university.
Thanks,
Could
Matt.
keep it much bigger. Yeah.
Before I speak, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded land of the Gadigal people. That's a phrase that's now coming into when we acknowledge people, people's country where we meet people. My name is Peter Pennington. I'm Narangiri from South Australia, mouth of the Murray, Dakota, Sandrina, and the Coorong. But I grew up in Adelaide, and there I worked as a social worker in 1978. And I thought about the health of young Aboriginal men then, and I'm now doing research in relation to, hopefully going to be doing research in relation to how they use social media for their health and well-being as well, and to look at maybe best practice programs for them to develop them as well. There's a book called Holding Men, which is Kenyan Impa by Brian McCoy, who's a Jesuit priest who's worked in Kimberley for a long time and written a book about that health practice, Kenyan Impa, and I think that those sort of principles in that program and that practice are still exist here on the East Coast, but are espoused in different ways, in a way. So that's what I hope to do in the next 3 years.
Oh, thank you, Pete.
Dean Jarrett. I've been at the UTS since about 2010, I think, in different roles and teaching and whatnot, did my masters and stuff. But now I'm just about sort of, most of my thesis now is at the editor, so my date that I handed in the EWS, what's it? Estimated work submission is the middle of December. So hopefully that'll be all bedded down and tucked away. But my mob's a Gumbanga mob up the Nambucca, from Nambucca area on Dad's side, and other mobs from Queensland from Warrabinda. But my study, I think, has probably a direct alignment with what Native Nations is all about, rebuilding and nation rebuilding. So in terms of economic development, what I did was a comparison between Native American-owned companies that sort of were off the reservations, not on the reservations, but in regional centres in the southwest corner, and our Indigenous businesses here in Australia on the east coast, in Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne. So
just a small
yeah, just a small study. Taken only 4.5 years. And this afternoon I'm presenting at with Chris over.
Oh yeah,
I don't
I
know if
saw
anyone's
that.
coming along to that.
Yeah.
But that's on this afternoon.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a clear-cut relationship there between what my study is and as I presented at the early sort of preliminary findings, I suppose, at Native Nations over at U of A when I was there.
Thanks, Steve.
I'm Alison. I'm a Gomeroi woman. I grew up in Dunnerdar and Tamworth, which are kind of in the northwest of New South Wales, up near Anawam Mob. I just came back from the US probably 2 or 3 months ago, and while I was there I was studying one, kind of nation building, and two, I was researching how Australian justice systems respond to police violence in Australia. And I guess my secondary area of research is Indigenous peoples and poetry and literature. I'm trying to find a way to merge the two. So far has not been very successful, but I'm giving it a red hot go.
Not many poetic police out there.
Yeah.
Nathan West, Biripi man from mid-north coast, but I grew up in Newcastle. I have a background in development, I guess the nuts and bolts of it, but since working in the field for a while, I did my Masters in Economic Development, Anthropology of Development, and now I'm second year, technically second year PhD here at UTS, engaging quite heavily with nation building work, looking at pervasive approaches to economic development. I've worked, my Masters was looking at economic development in Indigenous communities in the Peruvian Amazon, specifically around, I guess, the employment of extractive projects, gas mines. I'm currently in a bit of a crossroads and hope to I guess, unpack that a little bit today for hearing you talk.
Oh, no pressure.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank
Great,
you.
thanks.
I'm Eva Cox. I'm attached to Jumbunna. I used to teach here and taught research methods and advocacy and policy and feminism and various other things, and sort of changed things. But about a decade ago, I resigned my teaching thing and came over to Jumbunna because I thought I wanted to learn something, different views of the world. I mean, my background is a refugee child. I was born in Vienna 2 weeks before Hitler marched in, so actually started life as a refugee in England, so I'm sort of come from the other end of having no sense of those sort of country ties and things, which is one of the reasons I think I'm very interested in where one goes across those sort of various spectrums. I mean, as I say, I've taught research methods, I've done some evaluation, which has just been sort of blamed for somebody's arrival here, of things like the the cashless debit card and the intervention of the various other things. And I'm really interested in how one sets up structures that don't demolish people, and in particular how we move out of the assumption of the materialist economic sort of thing being the only thing that counts. I'm trying to run a campaign at the moment which is based on we are citizens, not customers, and we live in a society, not an economy, which I think works very well within both my conception of feminism and my conception of indigenous things, because we've got to get away from the idea. It only occurred to me a few weeks ago, if you think about it, a citizenship involves a set of obligations and responsibilities and rights. Customer, if you think about it really, in its full thing, is a distrust relationship. We're constantly told, don't accept it, don't be loyal to your bank, don't be loyal to your what's your provider, don't be. So in a sense, it's not too surprising we have a massive amount of distrust of government coming up, because the government keeps telling us to be customers. It's also individuated, not collective. So I'm interested in trying to, and that's the reason I've come along today, to run something about how we get back to putting the social policy on the agenda. Partly those people doing stuff on economics, I think it's fucked us up better than more or less any other framework, because it's materialist. It has no way of coping with things like ethics, relationships, emotions, feelings, unless you shove some psychology in, and that doesn't work all that well.
It's a different currency.
So it's interesting that this work started with an economic bent, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it's kind of turned up.
And it sort of changes. So, I mean, at the moment, and I've got a card here, we're trying to put up a Good Society website so that we can actually collect things. And I'd love to have some of this stuff up there to get people to actually put up proposals about what we want. I think we've become very good at telling people what we don't want, but I think we need to actually put down what we want. I think that's a difference, because I'm a veteran of the 70s social movements, 70s type stuff. Then we optimistically believed we could change things. I think at the moment there's much more pessimism around.
Oh yeah.
All people are trying to do is stop things, but you don't change, you don't stop things unless you put up alternatives. So protests are fine, but at some point you've got to say, but do X instead, because otherwise they go and fuck it up again.
Yeah.
You know?
I think that's why
Yeah,
this
that's
research
right.
is interesting, because it does
So
talk
anyhow,
about
so I've come along
alternatives.
to sort of see how some of the stuff that I could see spreading over of trying to put society back on the agenda is really thinking, oh, I also did the 1995 Boyer lectures, which was called Truly Civil Society, which is still online. There's a pirate copy online if you put it in, which is quite interesting because I predicted then that moving down the economic pathway was going to undermine the social, and this is what's happening, and that's why I'm interested, because I think it's much more about the social. It's a social nation you're trying to put together, it's not an economic one, I assume.
Thanks. Thanks, Eva. Yeah.
Okay, Lyndon Coombs, the Welleroy man from northwest New South Wales. I've been in Aboriginal affairs for just over 20 years. I'm not an academic, but I'm pretending to be.
We're easy to imitate. So
I started out in government, ran a couple of not-for-profit Aboriginal organisations and went over to the dark side with PwC 4 years before I came here with their Indigenous consulting group, being a political advisor and different other things. But got the opportunity to come on here February this year with Larissa and Jumbunna to sort of try and mash all of that stuff learned across sort of different sectors. And similar to Eva, we would sort of, while I was trying to sort of think about research and all this type of stuff, I had a penny drop moment when I heard, I think Hitchens was talking about slavery. And he had this phrase called, how do we make good? And it just had the penny drop moment. It's like, how do we make good? How do we, so we're always talking, describing the problem really well. And then, something happens, there's an apology, and, the population's like, well, we're done now, that'll go away. It's like, nah, if you want us to go away, here's the things that you want to do, and that's sort of the type of stuff I'd like to really zero in on.
Yeah.
But still figuring it out, really.
Great.
Yeah.
We should
Because I
kind of
know
just
I started
start by
years ago.
introducing ourselves.
Yeah.
Sure. Who are you?
Hi, it's great to meet all of you, and some I've met before many times, and some just a few times, so and some for the first time. And I'm going to see if I can use Peter's language that he's just taught me. It's great to be here on the Yonsei land of the Gadigal people, and I want to acknowledge their country and their elders and respected persons, and acknowledge all the Indigenous people in the room who are emerging scholars and established scholars and leaders in their communities. My name is Miriam Jorgensen, and I work primarily for Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona. I'm also on staff here at Jumbunna, working closely with Allison. And I was originally trained and still hold a title with the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. My background was originally in pure economics and the math. I did a second undergraduate degree at Oxford where I did all the ologies and graphies, and a degree that was called Human Sciences, which really was a great counterweight to neoclassical economics. And then I did political economy in my graduate studies and international development, which continued to do that broadening out of sort of, you kind of go narrow and deep with the sort of neoclassical economics, and then the breadth of all the ways to think about how to learn about how human societies, and I hesitate to even call it human societies, how societies operate. So that's been kind of the overarching academic frame that I come to my work from, but we'll talk more about what that is. I'll let Steve introduce himself. Thanks. Oh wait, let me say one more thing, which is also, my home is in South Dakota. My original home was in South Dakota, the United States. I work for University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona, and for Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and for Jumbunna in Sydney. But I live in St. Louis, Missouri, with my husband and my 2 children.
She's one fragmented person.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Al. My name's Stephen Cornell from the United States, and like Miriam, I just want to acknowledge the privilege of being in this country, the country of the Gadigal people, and I'm sorry, Peter, but the Yonsei people?
Unceded.
Unceded.
I thought you said Yonsei.
Yes.
Unceded, yes.
Thank you for clarifying that.
There's been no decision made. King George gave explicit instructions to Philip Arthur, who came here, to treat us as subjects.
Right. No, that's an important word, and I very much appreciate it. But it's a privilege for me. I'm not an Indigenous person. I'm a pretty standard issue white fella, and but I've had the privilege with Miriam and other colleagues of spending the last 3 decades plus working with a lot of Indigenous nations, particularly in North America and the US and Canada, but also in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and here in Australia. And that's been an extraordinary personal experience for me, and intellectual experience, and I'm very grateful for that. And it's a pleasure to be here in your country and your territory. I'm a sociologist. That is what you do if you don't really know what you want to do. They tell you, well, if you don't know what you're doing, go do sociology, because you can do anything under that. So I'm sort of the opposite of Miriam. She's the specialist, and I'm the person who just,
I'm a sociologist too.
Oh, you are? Well, there we are. Did most of my work at the University of Chicago, and then at Harvard University, where I met Miriam and Joseph Kalt, and where we started the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development 31 years ago. And I thought I want to give you just a very quick background on that, and then tell you something about some current thinking, and maybe it will resonate, maybe not. What we found in the late 1980s in the United States was some data which showed that some American Indian nations were actually doing rather well at accomplishing their own objectives, whether those were economic objectives or social objectives, land consolidation, and others were just spinning their wheels and having a great deal of difficulty getting any traction in pursuing their own agendas. And we thought this was potentially an important difference, and that it would be worth finding out why. What's the difference between the nations that are making progress against their objectives and the ones that aren't? And that was the origin of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. We were fortunate to get some Ford Foundation funding to do that research. We were fortunate to find Miriam, and she came on board and has been central to that research over the last 3 decades. And some intriguing results came out of that research, and I'll just, and some of you are probably very familiar with this, but I think there were 3 key points that came out of it. The first was, if Indigenous nations are going to be successful at pursuing their own objectives, they have to be the ones making the decisions. That as long as Washington or some other state or national government is deciding for Indigenous people, don't expect much to change. The second finding coming out of that research was, but they've got to back up decision-making power with capable decision-making, capable, what we called capable governance. You've got to be able to govern well. You've got to be able to mobilize a community on behalf of your objectives. You've got to be able to make decisions and stick to them. You've got to be able to get things done. That wasn't a particularly exciting finding. It came out of some of the development research of the 1970s and 80s, governance matters. But a lot of that research said, yes, governance matters, and what you need is good old neoliberal governing systems of the sort that the United States has. And so my country went around the world telling people, you need better governance. In fact, you need our governance. So here it is. And that was well received, of course, and has a terrible track record. And what our research showed was, yes, you do need capable governance, but it also has to be a governance that resonates with the people who are being governed, who feel it's their governance, that reflects their ideas about how authority should be organized and exercised. And I think that was actually the key finding in the Harvard Project research, because what it really said was, if a central government, the United States, Canada, Australia, Aotearoa, if they're interested in resolving Indigenous problems, the first thing they need to start doing is listening to Indigenous people about how those problems might be solved, and respecting the right of those people to govern themselves in ways of their own choosing, not in ways of Washington, D.C.'s choosing or something like that. Over the last 30 years, we've taken those findings and done a lot more research, and it's led us beyond the United States, first into Canada, then at the start of the 2000s here to Australia back in 2001. An Indigenous governance conference in Canberra where we did some presentations on some of the US findings. It was a mostly Indigenous audience, and basically they said, gee, this is interesting. Maybe there's some resonance here. And I think a lot of what we've been engaged in over the last 15, 18 years now is actually learning more as we've changed contexts. We find that some of the principles of that Harvard Project research have been strengthened, have been repeated, have come out of work in other countries, but we've also seen intriguing ways that Native nations, once turned loose, start to solve some of their problems. And one of the things that's emerged over the last 15 years is what I think of as an international network of indigenous innovation, where we find nations talking to each other across these international boundaries. Someone like Dean comes to the US and talks about what his interest is here, and you find indigenous people in the US saying, we've got that problem. Here's how we're dealing with it. How are you dealing with it? Maybe we can learn something from what your mob has done, and maybe we can tell you a bit about what we're doing. And I think that kind of communication is becoming increasingly important as a way of shortening the learning curve. Gee, if some Maori have solved the language revitalization problem in New Zealand, let's grab some of their learnings and put them to work. So that's part of what we're doing. The only other thing I wanted to talk about is, and then I'll turn it over to Miriam. One of the things that I think we've really seen over the last 30 plus years is a change in indigenous politics in all four of these countries. When I was in graduate school starting to do work on American Indian political activism in the United States, the politics was all about rights and recognition. It was indigenous nations going after the US government saying, you need to abandon these assimilationist policies, you need to recognize us, you need to affirm our rights. That was a very productive politics. It had some momentous occasions in it that many of you know, just as there were here in that kind of politics. I think in all four of the countries that I've worked in, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, we saw that kind of politics, but over the last 30 years, we've seen a shift from a politics about rights and recognition to a politics about governance. And at the heart of that shift, and I think a young Indigenous Australian man captured it for me about 10 years ago here, when he said to me, if we wait for Canberra to recognize our rights, we're going to die waiting. So why don't we just get on with doing what we think we need to do? And I think part of what has happened is not abandoning the rights struggle, but saying, let's just do it. Let's act like nations. Let's figure out how to exercise the rights we believe we have, whether Ottawa, Washington, Wellington, Canberra recognizes those rights or not. Let's behave that way. And it reminds me of the Czechoslovak President Václav Havel, who led much of the fight against communist occupation in Czechoslovakia. And he wrote a wonderful essay in which he says, the key in life under communism is to live as if you were a free man. Just live as if you were a free man. And I think for a lot of indigenous nations, what's happening is they've decided we're going to act like nations, whether that government recognizes us as nations or not. We're going to live as if we were free nations, doing the things we need to do. And when you make that transition from a rights and recognition struggle to a let's do it struggle, a couple of things happen. You stop centering government and what it does, and you worry about what are we going to do. And I think we're seeing a new generation of younger leaders who honor what happened in the rights struggle and realize they're products of it, but are now saying we're less interested in what Washington, D.C. decides and more interested in what we decide. And we're not actually going to worry about them. We're going to get on with our agenda. And I think part of what we find our work has evolved into over these years is a look at, okay, what do these governance movements by indigenous nations look like in these four countries and in others? We're starting to do some work in Latin America and beginning to see evidence from nations who live under even more hostile environments than what you have here. So we're starting to kind of do that comparative work that says, what does the assertion of self-governing power look like under these different rights regimes, with these different legal frameworks in these different places, and what can indigenous nations learn from each other as they push that envelope and struggle to assert those self-governing powers? So that's a lot of what I think our work is now kind of evolved into. And I'm going to see what Mary wants to add to that.
So a lot of the work that I've been engaged in Australia over the last 8 years, through work that I was first brought here on an ARC that Larissa was the lead on, but that was really written by former Jumbunna researcher Mark McMillan, and also Allison together wrote a discovery project and asked me to join that. And so that work turned into some other grant-based work through Melbourne University and then another ARC linkage. And a lot of that's been focused on asking some really simple questions. Steve's kind of giving you some very big picture information about the findings from North America, kind of boiled down to the indigenous control matters. We talk about indigenous nation self-determination, so that's the first finding, that indigenous nations are in the driver's seat, that they back that up with institutions of governance that work for them, and that those have to be effective and legitimate, that cultural legitimacy. We add on other pieces too that seem to have come from less quantitative research. Those pieces can have some pretty strong quantitative econometric style research behind them, backed up with a lot of in-depth community-based case studies too, to kind of really flesh out where those findings come from. But other pieces that really seem to matter are when a nation, an indigenous political collective, has the capacity to do some really long-term strategic thinking and planning, and when it adopts a really long-term rather than a short-term view. We talk about it, that shift from being reactive to being proactive, from thinking about somebody else's agenda to working on your own agenda. And then also it seems to really matter to have people in place, and we call them nation building leaders, but they don't have to be kind of an organizational leader or an elective leader. They really come from any place within the community. They're the kinds of people who can enunciate that sort of vision, who can help hold those hard conversations about who are we as a people, things like that. So we kind of have tended in much of our work in the last, particularly in the last decade, but it's emerged from this 30 years of work to talk about self-determination, effective institutions, culturally legitimate institutions, having a strategic vision, and nation-building leadership. So those principles really are the underlying nation-building principles emergent from research, but that also have, we think, usefulness to Native nations, and have proven useful to Native nations in North America as they're trying to shift toward a nation-building framework. They can sort of say, we're going to start to work according to those principles, and that's going to help us achieve our goals. So you can feel that they're both research evidence when we ask the question of, well, when Native nations seem to be doing well, what are they doing? What has led to that? And it's these principles, and then you can shift that around and say, well, does applying them then help people get on with what they're doing? There had been a lot of conversation in Australia, particularly during the knots, so the 2000 to 2010 range, and this is kind of where the original ARC came from. There had been a lot of people both in the academy and in the policy sectors where academics and policymakers were saying this evidence doesn't apply here. These findings don't apply here because we have a very different history. While they're both British settler states, the United States and Canada and Australia, that British settler history is somewhat different. There's a completely different legal framework within which Indigenous peoples operate between the US and Canada and Australia. And there's different ways that Indigenous peoples have organized themselves, and there might be similar issues around close the gaps or kinds of social concerns, but that those are being addressed in very different social organization ways. So we really just asked the question really simply of, so does the North American evidence apply? I mean, in a sense, people had kind of jumped to the conclusion of things are too different here, it doesn't apply. So we just asked the question, does it? And I think we really boil it down to two ways of asking that question. The first was looking out across Australia and saying, are there self-constituted political collectives? And you can tell I'm kind of using that sort of sociology, political sciencey sort of language, but what I'm talking about is a people. Is there an Indigenous people that has identified themselves as an Indigenous people that has achieved self-identified goals? They've set goals for themselves and they've gotten there. And that if we really do a deep dive into the history of how they got to that place, of how they achieved those goals, do we see that these nation-building principles were how they did it? So it wasn't trying to do some big, large sample piece of research. It was to say, is there a self-identified indigenous political collective that has achieved success, and how did it achieve that success? And that was the crux, really, of the work that we did in our first ARC, working with the Narrandera Nation, so with Peter's Nation, and also with the Gunditjmara people of Southwest Victoria, one of the Gunditjmara peoples that are in that coastal region. And it was pretty clear from a lot of desktop research that those two peoples, amongst others that we had identified, but those were the two that really seemed to rise above the rest of having self-constituted as a people, and that were really making tremendous strides. Allison in particular was instrumental in reaching out to leadership and cultural authorities and policy-making authorities within those communities, and we gained the opportunity to do this kind of deep dive research. And our research points to the fact that the nation-building principles really do apply, that they were a tremendously important part of the way that those nations achieved their goals. So rather than sort of looking at the superficial differences between the United States and Australia, we said, can we look at what Native nations actually did and the principles we seem to apply? The other way we asked the question has been much more part of the linkage project that we'll close out in probably 12 to 18 months. And that project has asked the question of, again, looking for these self-identified indigenous political collectives. And I'm going to get back to that. I keep saying that, and I'm going to get back to that because I think that's an important question. Are there self-identified indigenous political collectives that have set goals for themselves, and do they find the nation-building principles useful in moving toward those goals? So again, that's there's that, how did people get to where they are, and are these principles useful as sort of standards for moving towards success? And in conversations and research with organizations and individuals within the Wiradjuri Nation, individuals and organizations within the Noongar Nation, and basically the leadership group within the Gugubada Nation. So we're really geographically looking at a lot of different areas too, and evidence emerging from others who we have more one-off relationships with. It does seem to be that the answer to that question is yes as well, that these principles are useful to those Native nations moving toward their goals. So we think that as the translation has been made to Australia, research is pointing to the fact that these principles do apply, that they're useful. Now the work, I think, is really moving toward two new kinds of questions. They've always been present, but we're really forced to wrestle with them a lot more now that we feel that we have evidence in hand that this stuff applies. And that first is that vexing question of what is a Native nation in the Australian context? Because really the unit of analysis to do all of this work that we did in North America is what in North America typically gets called a tribe or a Native nation. And they have that legal recognition as such. That doesn't exist in Australia. We'll go back to what Steve said, is just get on with things, and it's clear that a number of self-identified political collectives, and you can open up a newspaper or go online or see policy documents from South Australia, and Narrandera Nation is all over stuff. There's a self-identified political collective that's what they call themselves, right? The Gunditjmara people of Southwest Victoria that call themselves the Gunditjmara people. And so it's really, those instances are clear. But because of the particular colonial history in Australia, and I think that Roz's opening statement of, I don't know who my mob is, but I've been accepted into a mob on the Gold Coast area. Think how typical that is across Australia, right? And so this question of self-identified political collective is really hard in areas where you've got just a huge overlay of stolen generation. You have these massive urban areas like Sydney and Melbourne where so much of the Australian Aboriginal population and Torres Strait Islander population lives, and so they're not on their original country, they're being hosted on somebody else's unceded territory. So these questions about what is a self-identified political collective become really hard. On some level, some of the Native title work starts to resolve it, but that doesn't really resolve it in a place, say, like Palm Island or in the middle of Newcastle or something. So I think there's some really tough and interesting, both theoretical and empirical and community-based work to be done to say if what is necessary for Native nations to achieve, or indigenous nations or indigenous political collectives to achieve their goals, is to create that sense of self-identified political collective. That self-identification has to occur, and there has to be some of those hard conversations around, well, what role does that mean traditional owners have? Does that mean that historical occupants are excluded? Does that mean we have one set of arrangements for country, land, waters, plants, animals, native title sort of types of issues, and then we have a different set of arrangements for more pan-Aboriginal sorts of issues, but people collaborate on those things. So that's kind of that big theoretical and conceptual and practice question. I think the other place that our work has gone, and largely because of changes that we've seen in policy at the state level, the Aboriginal, why am I always getting the, what's the ARA stand for? Regional Authority process in South Australia, the self-determination treaty discussions in Victoria, and to some extent the local and regional governance policies of New South Wales toward Indigenous nations. And I know that there have been some similar conversations in Northern Territory. Both Queensland and Western Australia, I suppose, not surprisingly, really haven't gone there yet. I don't know anything about Tasmania, so, and the ACT is just the ACT, right? So, but at least in those three states, we have these emergent conversations that seem to give rise to an opportunity for self-identified political collectives to engage with the state in new kinds of recognition and legal right seeking. And it really,
the Noongar, they're moving in that
that's
direction.
right, and they did the just do it thing too, yeah. So but at the level of state policy, it's less clear that the states have that kind of engagement. But a lot of our work right now is trying to engage with those state policy mechanisms and help them sort of better understand what the nation building results are and how it meshes with these new policies. So I talked for a lot longer than I was probably supposed to, but that's kind of where we think our work is kind of at right now.
I just want to ask a follow-up question to that conversation. I think that was very interesting. But you know, you've made the point about the self-identified political collectives. But how does that start? How does that start when you're in an environment where the state wants to tell you what to do? I didn't say it was an easy question.
Oh no, I actually have some answers, and I think it helps. Actually, maybe do some of the work that Allison's interested in.
Go for it.
So, Allison, you raised this thing if you're really interested on one hand in these questions around law and policy, right? Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, you're really interested in literature and poetry and creative arts kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that a lot of the work that we get to these self-identified political collectives is not actually ever having first the conversation about law and policy. Mm-hmm. I think we get there oftentimes by doing things that feel unrelated, but of course they are related. So when people are telling their stories and they're writing poetry about who they are, or they're engaging with their hands in harvesting traditional food, or even growing food that's not traditional but they're working together on it, you're getting into that different brain space that creates community or reestablishes community, and it thickens that that social bond between people, and then makes it possible for some of those harder conversations to occur. There's an Aboriginal artist in, I think she's Yupik, so she's from the area now known as Alaska. She's operated and worked out of Minneapolis for years because of her own diaspora. And she has a performance art series of projects where this is what they do. They do submitted written poetry and other spoken word art that begins the performance series. She curates that. Then they do a community project. Actually, I think they first do a community project together, usually environmental. Then they do spoken word art and poetry. And then they come together for a dance performance that she and her company put on. And then they share a potluck meal together, and it takes place over 4 days. And the point of it is to build community. And it's to reestablish those social boundaries that create nation, that allows space to develop where that law and policy conversation can occur. So I think of your work, Allison, and you say, I don't know how they relate, but I look at it and say, oh, I absolutely know how they relate.
No, sorry, Allison, please.
I was just going to confirm, I'm seeing that take place back home. Huge cultural revival is happening around women's weaving and arts and dance. And it's being led by, I guess, nation-building leaders, who I didn't even conceptualize as nation-building leaders until what you just said, so leading weaving practices, being able to build economic capacity from that weaving, then funneling those funds into language revival and doing all these incredible spiraling things that are just building more and more momentum.
And the hard part is government, Commonwealth and state government oftentimes wants it to stop there. They don't want that to turn into the conversation about political collective. They're okay with cultural collective. They're okay with social boundary. And so the challenge for Aboriginal people is then to push that to the next stage.
What I was just going to add, though, to what Marion said was two other situations that I think are particularly difficult along the lines of what you just asked, Al. And one is urban areas where a number of people have either extremely fragmented identities in the sense that they see links to many peoples through their own genealogy, or they really don't know what those links might be. And one of the things we're seeing actually in Aotearoa among Maori, all these economic settlements, for example, that have been made between some iwi tribes, and if we can call them that, and the New Zealand government, those have been focused very much at the level of iwi, and there's a lot of resistance in some of the urban areas among urban Maoris saying, wait a minute, we're being left out of this, because our relationships with iwi may be very thin, very fragile, or we don't even know what they are. But what we're seeing lately is some urban Maori saying, well, why can't we be an iwi? What's sacred about the history that you have as an iwi? At some point when those canoes arrived in New Zealand, people decided, okay, the line of descent will be from those canoes. But we've arrived, a bit like a canoe, in the urban area of Auckland, and why can't we assert that that's the origin of our iwi? So what you're seeing is a kind of very basic nation building that's starting almost from nothing, in the sense of no obvious template for organizing like that. But that conversation is happening because there's so many people who feel those connections to their own ancestors have become so thin and so fragile. And then, of course, we've got some situations in the United States where you have people who've been crammed together and who are facing a structure in the organization of Indigenous affairs that says, no, we'll tell you who you are. You're the people of the Flathead Reservation in Montana. And the fact that that's actually 3 different peoples forced together under a treaty to live together, but they have made a conscious decision, okay, we're going to become the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Reservation. We'll make a decision about how we're going to do nation building. And I think this is part of that self-determination piece, is the ability to determine who the self is. That's the most fundamental piece of self-determination, is who are we? Not just what are our rights and what do we get to do, but who are we? And we shouldn't assume that that's got to be limited to, oh, well, if you can't trace your ancestry back, then you're nobody.
And that's not to dismiss that there are critical connections all around the world between Indigenous peoples and a particular country. One of the things that I think we've seen somewhat in North America is, as these self-identified political collectives solidify and develop a sense of self, that there's then also, sometimes quickly, sometimes years later, that really important conversation resumes of how do people who have responsibility for this land, but who are not on this land, still exercise that responsibility. And so we've started to see interesting porousness of borders. I'm thinking particularly about some Kootenai, and they're called Tanaha people north of the border they're in what's now called Canada. They're connected to Kootenai and Tanaha people south of the US-Canada border. And in this group that Steve mentioned, the Confederated Tribes of the Flathead Reservation, they're Salish people, Pend d'Oreille people who have also Salish roots, and Kootenai people. And so how do those folks from Canada who are on their own country, but their country extends south, and some of it's encompassed by this land that's now shared by Kootenai and Salish people, how do they exercise responsibility to that territory? Well, they didn't. There was an interruption. There was an interruption when they couldn't exercise some of that responsibility. But now, as these nations have kind of firmed themselves up as Indigenous nations, they've started to have external relationships with one another. Kootenai or Tanaha people from Canada travel south to exercise their responsibilities on Kootenai land that's to the south. And Kootenai people who are part of that confederated nation exercise their responsibilities on that land, but also travel north as well. So you have these, what are political collectives and cultural collectives that intersect and overlap but aren't quite the same thing. So that it's taken years to work out some of this stuff, but it does show that there are ways to have cultural boundaries and political boundaries that overlap and intersect. So.
Does anyone have any questions or?
Success being recognised. It's one of the, like, being recognised, one of the components, or recognising yourself. The nations, if they're hiding by choice or don't want to participate, and success is survival, then does that, I guess, like, I have a bit of trouble sometimes.
How important is formal legal recognition by?
Well, like, I think more like, is it
personal or is it external?
no, the two can be running all the time. Like, it's not like a new sense of sovereignty or a new sense of nation exists, that it's always existed. Like, the responsibility was stopped because the responsibility never stopped. It was
it was
Yeah.
there was an interrupted in people's
or even
people's ability to
interrupted. The
practice
responsibility
that.
was still there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a lot of
the
cases,
manifestation, I guess, of it is different.
and I like your term hidden, because I think in some cases people felt they had to hide it.
Oh, yeah.
If you didn't hide it, it was going to get smashed.
Mm.
And so people, in a sense, took what was most important to them underground, where it was invisible to power. And then when the power dynamic changed, it began to reemerge again.
And we see that here too, of course, don't we, where, you know, we sometimes refer to what we see as kind of governing by stealth, because why would you invite state and federal governments to come in and attack you? So, you know, kind of governing arrangements, decision-making arrangements, you know, kind of sit in corporate institutions and, you know, are kind of protected from scrutiny in a way.
So, when you're doing the comparative stuff, is there anything in Australia that stands out as unique, either good or bad? Well, I was thinking, I went to the Permanent Forum in 2013, and the Australian delegates were just zero focused on government, and then Native Americans got up and didn't talk about government once. You know, is that sort of dynamic? Is there anything that sort of really stands out in terms of our governance as opposed to other Indigenous?
I mean, I guess, do you want to?
Go ahead.
To me, the thing that really stands out is how effective Australia as a nation state has been in pan-Aboriginalizing issues here. In some of our work, we talk about the big A Aboriginal kind of issues, and there absolutely are issues that affect every single Aboriginal person and every Aboriginal political collective that are out there. And those are issues that you can create these coalitions around. But I think it's been also a way that the Australian government has destroyed people's ability to self-collect and has focused that level of protest only at that. It's an important type of protest, but I think the experience suggests it's not the only kind. And now I'm kind of going down a pathway. Steve did a tremendous amount of work originally 30 years ago, before the Harbor Project stuff, on thinking about the difference between tribalism and pan-Indian stuff in the US. And there's a history of that in Canada and the United States too, but tribalism, in other words, native nationhood, indigenous nationhood, indigenous political collectives that then make up the entirety of an Aboriginal population, those things in a sense always had strength on each side. There were things that communities did as communities and expressed themselves and their political rights there, and things that people did all together. And it has just felt until recently, until things like the ARA policy or the treaty policy in Victoria and the regional governance stuff in New South Wales, that the Australian government hasn't been open to that. And that I think has been bad.
Yeah. I think one of the things, though, which we, and Allison just mentioned, and one of the things that we've seen here that I think it really is instructive for a lot of other places potentially, has to do with what Allison called stealth governance. We had a group of fairly young, 30s, 40s, Indigenous leaders from Australia or people who were kind of trying to change things come over to the United States to look at Indigenous governance issues. This was back in about 2008. And we took them around to several nations in the southwestern United States and then to 3 nations in British Columbia to talk about governance. And at the end of the 2 weeks that they were there, I did a debriefing with them in a room like this. There were, I think, 9 of them, and just on what sort of they felt they'd learned. But I also said to them, if we were to take a group of Indigenous leaders from the United States to Australia and do what we just did with you, what do you think they would learn? And one of these, one young woman, she said, I think they'd learn what's possible under much more hostile conditions. You know, in the United States, I think a lot of Indigenous people, their experience, it has been very hostile, but it also has provided, through treaty making and other things, a kind of a rights framework which becomes a basis for political action, which is missing here. And there are other differences between Australia and the United States. And what I see here that sometimes is most striking to me is what Indigenous communities have done under those extremely difficult conditions. And Allison mentioned something we call stealth governance. It's that, okay, ORIC requires us to make decisions in the following way if we're going to get funds. And that's fine, we'll comply, but the real decisions will be made in the shadows, underneath the radar, where a way of making decisions that we're comfortable with, our way of making decisions, will actually function. And then we'll comply and communicate to you on the right letterhead of our traditional owners corporation or whatever it might be, what that decision is. And I think in a way what we've learned here, one of the things we've learned here is the possibilities of just do it.
And that is actually really important, and I know all of you are aware of the Dakota Access Pipeline issues, the DAPL issues. One of the aftermath pieces of that is because there was so much political action around that, right? A lot of the Lakota and Dakota tribes in North and South Dakota, those tribes were, in a sense, created through the recognition process that created reservation and then had governmental recognition at various periods of U.S. history. So those were tribes that were not originally self-identified political collectives. They're political collectives that were identified by the U.S. government. And now they're operating under that rights framework that exists in the U.S., but a lot of the post-DAPL conversation that I've heard that emerged from the activism of DAPL was those nations saying to themselves, we actually are one really big nation, and maybe we're not necessarily going to get rid of these structures of recognition that create the Oglala Sioux tribe and the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe or whatever, but we need to find ways to collaborate more together. So one of the things that is happening is the creation of stealth governance that emerged from DAPL that's uniting these Dakota and Lakota nations, which I think is fascinating. I think that there's a lot that that effort could learn from Indigenous nations here.
And we see that there's an intensive 3-week program that's offered at the University of Arizona every January, and that's certainly something that we hear when there are Australian participants there, that that the ingenuity, the below the radar kind of operations, we get lots of, you do what? How do you do that? Tell me how you do that. Yeah. It's cool.
I'll say one other thing, which I think, I'm not sure really directly responds to your question, Lincoln, but I think Miriam, when she elaborated a bit on the Harvard Project research results, she mentioned this question of what's the strategic orientation as a critical thing that nations face. And I wanted to go back to something that Eva actually said in the introductions here. I think as nations obtain some political opportunity and political power, and I think this is starting to happen here through nations asserting that power, one of the questions they face is, why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve? And what I thought of earlier was, some of you may know Sir Tiffany O'Regan, who is a Maori elder with the Ngāi Tahu people on the South Island of Aotearoa, and was one of the architects of some of the economic settlements there, and really a major leader of that effort, who in a lecture he did at Charles Darwin University in Darwin here several years ago, really raised this question of Indigenous governance, Indigenous development. What are those for? What is our ultimate purpose? And I was teaching a class over in New Zealand in a Maori executive MBA program, and he came and did a guest lecture in the class, and he had this line that I thought was terrific. He said to all these Maori students, he said, do we just want to be rich Pakeas? That's white people. Do we just want to be rich Pakeas with a suntan? Or is our purpose, and I thought he captured beautifully one vision of purpose, or is our purpose the intergenerational transmission of identity and heritage? That transmission from this generation to the next, and the next, and the next, and the next, of what it means to be who you are. And is that the purpose? And that's what, when we think about things like economic development, that we think about it as giving ourselves the ability, the resources to do that under whatever conditions we face. And that then tells us, when we think about things like economic development, how do we want to develop? Because we start to measure it against that kind of thinking. And I think that strategic issue is one which I think we see now some nations in the US who, through things like the gaming industry, which has been a big deal for some nations, and others are starting to confront this question, wait a minute, what are we up to? A good friend of ours, a leader of one of the nations in the US, says, if we're not careful, we're going to end up assimilating ourselves. And I think that set of issues is another set that we're facing across these countries over the next decade or 2 or 3. This coming generation of leaders are going to have to wrestle with that question.
I'm going to pick up on that, because I think it's something that's very much happening at the moment, because I think one of the things that gives some power to the groups that you're talking about is the fact that they have been powerless. So they do have a sort of dominant group to extract themselves from. But the question then does remain, and I think that's one that's niggling at the back of my mind, is how much of what they originally had is still capable of functioning in a very different environment, which is a very different, particularly technologically, internationally, various other sorts of things, because they were pretty well based on a much more place-located construction. And how does one sort of adapt those things without taking on? I mean, one of the things I've just been writing and sort of wearing my feminist hat is looking at a universal basic income and using Simone de Beauvoir's concept of the second sex to say, as long as women accept it within that sort of masculine versions of what matters, we are the second sex because we're being other defined. And I think it's partly also that sort of thing about how do you work out who defines what, in a sense, in a very changing environment, because you can't just go back to what was, because
it was of its time.
It was of its time, yes. Yeah. And that's what I think we need to say, okay, how do we adapt it so it stays within our principles, which involves actually saying what our principles are very clearly, and sometimes that's the bit that gets missed out along the way. It's what we get what's not wanted, but not what the...
And that's one of the reasons when we do nation building seminars in community, we'll frequently share the results of the North American model and tell some stories. But then we really very quickly get to the discussion of, and it was a colleague of mine who said, stop asking the question, what are your values? Phrase it in a way that's better. I'm like, okay, what is that? She says, ask everybody what it is that you treasure about being X. What do you treasure about being Gadigal? What do you treasure about being Gunditjmara? What do you treasure about being Gugubat? And that starts to get to that, what binds people together, people, and what they want to protect in that intergenerational way moving forward.
Because the other factor you've got in that is, and I think it's a really important one, is that most of these societies we're talking about are communal, collective, connected, and so on. And one of the problems we're facing in the non-Indigenous communities at the moment is the fact that we've had, since the Enlightenment and the Protestant Revolution, a highly westernized sort of emphasis on the individual and on individualism, not on a collectivist model, and trying to intersect those. I mean, it doesn't work in in the non-Indigenous communities. It's now beginning to fall apart. But then you get to the point of what comes next, in a sense, because it's that Western so-called civilization does dominate in many ways.
Yeah, and I think that's really one of the challenges of contemporary nation building is how do we maintain connectedness in a world which has so many things happening that disconnect us.
Yeah.
And this is where I think things like social media and some of those things which has all sorts of negative potential and all sorts of positive potential, but it's also a resource which could be, if used in certain ways, could be part of what maintains connection among people who are constantly being pushed apart just by circumstance and by the necessities of life. But that question of how do you maintain connectedness, which I think of as a critical piece of nation maintenance, nation building, and there's reciprocity involved in that, but how do you maintain that over time today? That's a really intriguing question. Dean?
I don't know the detail of Christopher Lawrence's project, but I think he's looking at something like that now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I'm noticing the time, and just want to thank everyone for coming along. I think maybe we need to make sure that we can continue these conversations. I know that I'm going to, heavily give these guys more work, but I know that Steve and Miriam are both very good at responding to email. And so if you've got some follow-up questions...
That was a generous statement, how good we are at responding. I try to be good at responding.
I think there are people in this room who've experienced the fact that I'm not terribly good at responding.
But you have to harass us and then we respond.
Yeah, all right, a bit selective.
Have you got a website that does actually raise?
No, not yet. No, we're in the process of developing
it would be an interesting thing to have, because that's a way that you could actually have a discussion and sort of put stuff in.
Oh,
May I say one more thing?
of course, yes.
When I've travelled overseas, and I studied in Canada in 2003 in University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, and when I was talking to the mob over there, it's like talking to the mob here. Exactly the same issues, the holding up a mirror. And that's what, as Indigenous people internationally, that's what we share. That's what makes us strong. I think it's really important for us as Indigenous people to acknowledge that. And going back to what I said about my research, in relation to my co-supervisors, Professor Bronwyn Carlson at Macquarie University, who is an actual leading scholar in use of social media. But she talks about it in relation to building community relationships and those sort of things as well, what you were saying before, Stephen, about using social media with its pluses and minuses for it as well. So I think that's, thank you for what you said today, and I think it's given you lots of food for thought in relation to like governance and that wonderful word that we use here in Australia called self-determination and changing the politics of things too. We tried Makarrata back in the 70s in relation to sort of treaty and lots of things, but there may not be an overall treaty for Australia, but there might be individual treaties made like Victoria's doing at the moment. And governments don't like this, and Batman made a treaty in Victoria, and then that was thrown out by the Privy Council in England, because it was giving the local people in Melbourne their access to resources and this sort of thing. And more importantly, recognition is what he was, that they didn't like about that. And as I said, George III gave instructions to Arthur Phillip to treat us as subjects when he came here. He didn't. They had that, and we've never ceded the land, we've never ceded our politics either, or our governance either.